action. I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try.
Hello and welcome to Call to Action, the go-to podcast for anyone trying to make sense of the world of marketing, business and beyond. In an industry that is a minefield of utter bollocks, we aim to capture our heroes and allies from the front line to have a chinwag with. It's like Pokemon Go, with the single but vital exception that it's not a short-term bandwagon of shite. It's brought to you by Gasp and I'm Giles Edwards. Today I've caught Andrew Tenzer and Ian Murray, a pair of proper researchers. Andrew and Ian's treasure trove of award-winning work on the culture of marketing has been lauded by iconic business brains, including Call to Action alumni Orlando Wood and Steve Harrison. The duo behind the Empathy Delusion and the Aspiration Window have not long since launched Burst Your Bubble, described as a radical new consultancy powered by the art and science of perspective taking. They say, our studies show that in every framework we use, there are no differences between marketers based in London and those in other parts of the UK. It doesn't matter where you live. Your unconscious thinking styles, moral foundations, and values are the same. Not only that, when it comes to estimating the values and aspirations of mainstream audiences, non-London marketers get it just as wrong as marketers based in London. Welcome to the show, Andrew and Ian.
Thanks, Giles. Great to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Right, 7 quick-fire questions, starting with Ian. Nice stereotypical start here. Iron brew or Tunnocks tea cakes?
Tunnocks tea cakes.
Arteta or Wenger?
I have to go with Wenger.
Art or science?
Art.
Andrew, the road to somewhere or the righteous mind?
The road to somewhere.
Interesting.
Ian, Orlando Wood or Steve Harrison?
Orlando Wood.
Andrew, understanding or insight?
Understanding.
And lastly, Ian, bad research or no research?
No research.
Surprisingly easy. We must try harder.
Yeah.
Thank you both for joining us. So to start the show, we always ask every guest about their path to where they are now and find that more often than not, it's rarely linear. So could you start, we'll start with you, Andrew, if we can, by telling our audience what was your first ever job and then what was your first proper job?
So my first ever job was a friend of my parents had a menswear shop in Kilburn, in North London, on Kilburn High Road. So I think it was about 13. I worked in the shop serving customers, and I think probably the highlight of that was I remember working there near Christmas, and a mother came in frantically needing to buy clothes for her son for Christmas, and for whatever reason, I helped her a lot. She gave me a tip of £20, which at the age of sort of 12 years old in the early 90s was quite a lot of money. So that was good. In terms of my first proper job, it was working for the passport service. And I worked in the HR department, recruiting consultants for the ID cards project. Do you remember that, when Tony Blair wanted to bring in ID cards in the early noughties?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, spent a fortune on consultants and never actually saw the light of day, the ID card. So that was my first job.
How long did you work in the menswear shop? The reason I'm asking is because I find lots of people seem to have been kind of like frontline customer service type roles and maybe retrospectively take quite a lot from that. Whereas at the time, apart from, that £20 tip, probably don't realise what they're learning at the time.
Yeah, I think it was quite sporadic. I would sort of help out when I was needed. So it was sort of over a certain period of time, but I might work a Saturday, or one week I might work a Sunday in between school. But I mean, it's so long ago. I can't remember actually how long it was. But yeah, I definitely think you learn something from any job you do. It was a really good experience, actually. I look back at it quite fondly because I was quite young. So. And
did you know what you wanted to do when you were younger? And if so, was it what you are doing now? Because I've heard rumours about being a musician.
Yeah, those rumours are true. Yeah, I wanted to be a musician. So when I left university, I spent quite a long time in bands trying to make it, and eventually I had to give up, get a career because it didn't quite pan out as I'd hoped. But yeah, I wanted to be a musician. I still do, actually,
Yeah, it's
if I'm
never too
being
late.
honest. Yeah, a bit old
Um,
now.
what did you study at university?
I studied political science.
Right.
I did politics A level, and I got really into politics. Found it fascinating, but I got really into kind of the radical side of it, like anarchism and Marxism and things like that. But it was yeah, it was a enjoyable degree, but it's not a vocational degree. So at the end of it, you're kind of like, okay, so what do I do now? Because I didn't want to go into politics. That was for sure.
And so how did you go from studying political science to working in the passport service to what you currently do now?
Well, I mean, I've always wanted to work in media because my mum had worked in media in the sort of 70s and 80s. So I just looked for media jobs, and I applied for a job at Channel 4 working in airtime management, which was, scheduling the ads on across Channel 4, the Channel 4 portfolio. That was my first step into media, but I wanted more than that. I was really interested in research, and my older sister was working at YouGov at the time, when YouGov were kind of quite a small business, and they'd only just really got going. She told me about research and insight, and I thought, well, that's something that sounds really interesting. And then I started my journey where I had to leave Channel 4 in order to go into research. And then I found my way back to Channel 4 a few years later, and then it kind of kicked on from there.
That makes more sense. I couldn't see the thread. That's why I was pushing you on that, where that thread was.
Yeah. It's a loose thread.
Well, they often are, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. We mentioned Orlando Wood, or at least I did on the quick fires, and I know Orlando's love of history kind of retrospectively now makes sense given what he does, and the research that being such a significant part,
Yeah,
certainly
absolutely.
of his last few books. So it kind of makes sense that people who are interested in studying the past then study and research in the kind of context and space that they're in. So
And I think with politics as well, it's, politics, you understand structures and how people behave and philosophy and all of those things. And it's kind of very relevant to what we do.
yeah, that's very true. Ian, what about you? What was your first ever job, and then what you regard to be your first proper job?
So first ever job was a paper round. I don't know if kids have paper rounds anymore, but yeah, I had a paper round. And then a bit similar to Andrew, first job where, literally you showed up and had a boss, and everything would be in my local co-op supermarket when I was probably about 15, part-time job after school, Saturdays and Sundays, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, very important at the time. My background is I'm the eldest of 5 kids and brought up by a single mum, so getting a part-time job was a really big rite of passage because it frankly meant I could contribute a little bit at home, and also I was able to scrape enough money together to ask out the girl that I fancied at school, who became the first love of my life and got me all the way through university. So quite a big deal in terms of moving me on into the kind of adult phase of my life, I think.
And then did you go to university? I'm not suggesting anyone necessarily should or has to, but did you study anything?
Yeah. So and it's strange, as I think Andrew and I only figured this out relatively recently, that I did a politics degree at Glasgow University. Originally went to do an English literature degree, swapped out of that after the first year, jumped into it being a psychology degree in the second year, and landed up doing an honours degree in political philosophy. So straight after that, I went and did a master's degree in social research. That led me to my first proper job, which was actually as an academic researcher back in the politics department at Glasgow University. I was a research assistant to one of the famous psephologists of the time, Professor Bill Miller. I did that for a couple of years on a really big government-funded study into citizenship. So that was my first proper job in academia, basically.
And was that something that was you sought out? Was that very deliberate?
it's something I reflect on quite a lot now. There's been nothing deliberate in my career whatsoever, Giles. I mean, basically, when I was a kid, the main thing for me was just getting to university. And naively as it might sound now, I went to study things I was interested in. And I had no idea about what I was going to do when I finished. And I frankly had no one that was guiding me in that either, or even hassling me about what you're going to do with a political philosophy degree, or you started off doing English literature and now you're doing this. I just simply was directed by the things that interested me, and then landed out of the first degree. And at the time, probably there's been a couple of ones since, but one of the worst eras possible for graduates. And the main reason I did the master's degree, to be totally frank, was there were no jobs, so I had to just find something to do until hopefully the job market picked up. And then, as it turned out, I did a master's degree that gave me relevant research skills that were useful in an academic context, and went from there. So no plan whatsoever, just stuff I was interested in basically, and hoping it would work out somehow.
Ironically, Ian and I very rarely talk politics to each other, do we, Ian?
No,
It's
we
not,
don't.
not something we talk about all that much, even though we've
Yeah.
both got degrees in it.
So when did your paths first cross then? Because you've been working together for a while prior to starting your new consultancy.
I guess it's one of those quite random things, really. I'd just gone to be head of insight at what was Trinity Mirror, which is now Reach, or has been Reach for a good few years now. And back in 2017, when I joined, it was kind of post Brexit referendum, and the industry was starting to wake up a little bit more about being out of touch. And because Reach had quite a strong positioning in terms of its regional portfolio, and for years they'd been banging on about, you don't really understand your audience, and we're experts in the understanding of people, across the country. It didn't really gain all that much traction until Brexit happened. So I came in and I was given the opportunity to do some provocative, I guess, thought leadership. And I published a study in 2017 called When Trust Falls Down, which touched upon some of the issues of the industry being out of touch without going kind of full throttle into it. And then, out of the blue, I got I think you messaged me on LinkedIn, Ian, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
Just saying let's catch up. And Ian came to meet me in the office in Canary Wharf, which is where Reach is based. And yeah, it was kind of like an instant, we start chatting, and it, straight away I thought to myself, I really want to work with Ian. We see things the same way, and there's lots I can learn from Ian in terms of how he approaches research, particularly from the academic side of things.
The thing I remember is that it was one of those great meetings where there wasn't any kind of pitch or any kind of structure to it at all. I think we just rocked up at the office and talked for a while, and at the end of it I remember coming out with no formal plan, but I just was pretty sure we were going to do some work together. It's like just one of those, I suppose, the cliched meeting of minds, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a good chat.
And then you subsequently have obviously worked together. And I mentioned a couple of pieces of your work in the intro. Do you remember what the first piece was you kind of tackled in tandem?
Why we shouldn't trust our gut instinct, wasn't it? Gut instinct, Andrew?
Yeah, that was it. Yeah, I think it often gets forgotten about when we're talking about the kind of studies that we published, but that was kind of the first of the trilogy. And that's where I think we were talking about cross-cultural psychology and some of the experiments from that world. Ian was showing me all these crazy experiments that we could do. And I was just like, I love this. We should do this. And then I think the opportunity came up to do that, obviously on a nationally representative sample, but also on a sample of marketing and advertising people. And that's really just set the foundations for everything that's come since. And, some of the experiments we tried, just really quite interesting and exciting and different.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that, as well as Giles, what ended up in the white paper was only a fraction of what we tried, so it's a very good example of, and that's why it's such a great relationship, is that to be candid with you, I'd had some of the ideas, for some of the experiments, before, and I'd kind of suggested them to other clients, and no one, frankly, had the balls to do it, and that was the thing that why I was so excited when I met Andrew. I threw all of this at him, and he didn't. There was no sharp intake of breath, and like, interesting, but we're never going to do that. Right away, it was like, well, let's try some of this stuff. Yeah, I still think, as Andrew says, it's the one that probably, I don't know if it's forgotten, but it certainly didn't get the same kind of exposure as the empathy delusion, which came next. But I still think, when I look back at some of the results we got in gut instinct, I think some of that stuff's about probably the best stuff I've done in my career, because to take the kind of punt that you would be able to apply these things from global cross-cultural psychology and find a difference in a group of people who, on the face of it, the only thing they had in common was that they went into an agency or a brand and did marketing work, was quite a thing. And to get those differences, was really like, it's still, when I go back and look at it sometimes now, it's still some of the favourite stuff that we've done. These ideas that you show that the implicit kind of biases and the cultural assumptions that basically people in the industry aren't even aware that they have. It's my favourite still out of the three.
Can you give a couple of examples of those key findings?
Yeah, the core of it is this argument from cross-cultural psychology that there's basically two thinking styles, all based on a guy. If anybody's want to go and look at the source material for it, because we never claim that we invented any of these experiments. What we do is we read widely and we apply things, and very transparently reference our sources. So the book was the inspiration, if you like, was by a guy called Nisbet, and it's called The Geography of Thought. And it's basically just a collection of lots of different experiments from psychology, cross-cultural psychology. And the main things it was finding was the difference in the thinking styles there is between people who live in the East, very broadly speaking, Asia, etc., and the West, and that's us in the US and Western Europe. And the idea is that the West, and this won't be that surprising to people, is a quite highly individualistic, kind of society, and that's reflected in the way that we interpret the world. We see things in quite a kind of analytical way. We're always looking to categorise things and look for differences, and actually we're driven by prediction as well. And that's at a broad cultural level. That's not in the marketing industry or any other industry. Whereas people living in the East, very broadly speaking, there's broad brushstrokes here, have a more holistic kind of way of interpreting the world, which is much more viewing the world as interdependent, if you like a circle, having this more holistic view of relationships and interdependence between people, and frankly that the world is very messy and in some sense quite unknowable and unpredictable. So the book has all these really, really clever, incredibly creative experiments in it to try and prove these differences and illustrate them. And we applied some of those to, as Andrew says, a marketing sample and a sample of a nationally representative sample of the UK population. You ask people, for example, I might even ask you this one, Giles, you might know the answer if you've read the thing, So what goes with a monkey, a banana or a panda, Giles?
A banana.
A banana. And why is that? Because the monkey eats the banana?
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, what's interesting, lots of people in the industry would go, well, actually, it's the panda, because they're both animals, and that's the category, animals.
Right.
Yeah. Whereas people in the mainstream would go with a relationship thing. And that's the kind of thing that we fired loads of these crazy experiments like that at marketers and the general public. And we ended up proving this thing that the marketers ended up having this much more analytical and categorical and predictive straight line thinking kind of way to interpret the world versus the mainstream.
We also did one of, I think, our favourite things we've ever done was when we adapted an experiment where we were testing how much people take notice of context. And we had to create this kind of reel of where you have like a load of faces. The faces on some of them change, and you fire like 17 or 18 different faces of the same people. And then you ask, whether people noticed the faces changing. And people in the industry are much less likely to notice the changing facial expressions, which is ironic given that we're supposed to be an industry about context and things like that. So the whole thing about analytical thinking is kind of straight line thinking and filtering out context and things like that. And the thing is that was interesting about that study is the way that you can interpret that in terms of how the industry behaves and some of the practices that happen as a result of our kind of unconscious thinking styles and the culture of marketing more broadly. But there's loads of good stuff in that if anyone wants to read it.
But the thing about the faces is interesting because rather than even consciously notice it, what happens is that there's 5 figures and there's one that's in the foreground and then there's 4 others in the background. And it's done as a cartoon, so it isn't representing too closely any particular kind of demographic. But they're all like, as a cartoon, made to look, it's a blonde girl that's in the front, then there's people of different ethnicities and male and female in the background. But the point is, all you're asked to do is in each one, so you fire this image at people and you tell the respondent, tell me how, for example, happy or sad the girl in the middle of the picture is. Yeah. And what's happening is you look at her and you can go, well, she's smiling a lot, so that's maybe really happy or whatever. But what's happening in the background that you don't tell people is that the facial expressions of the 4 people in the background are changing as well. And they might be changing in a way that's consistent with the foreground figure, or it might be different. And the way you got the difference between the mainstream sample and the marketers was, it turns out that unconsciously, marketers from this individualistic, analytical kind of way of interpreting the world were solely focused on the figure in the middle, and they didn't build any information from the background, literally the background, into their assessment of how this person's feeling. Whereas what the mainstream did naturally and unconsciously was they were picking up the background information, and that got factored into their assessment of how the foreground figure was.
Right. So it's more like a relative measure. Yeah.
That's a much better explanation of the one I gave. So.
Yeah, think about how much the industry talks about context all the time and the importance of context, but it turned out on a kind of, unconscious bias level, people in the industry were less likely to be attuned to context, basically, and therefore their assessment of, and again, leading on to the empathy delusion, this idea that we can put ourselves in the shoes of someone else, an individual, and how they're feeling, well, we are less able to do that because we weren't using the same wide range of information that people in the mainstream were. So there's this fundamental disconnect in the story we tell ourselves in the industry and how we actually go psychologically about interpreting social phenomena, basically. So that's where we got started.
That's really interesting. My question to you on that then is, there's an article, funny enough, in Marketing Week, Andrew, that you wrote about research, and your first point says that almost all industry research comes from businesses pushing an agenda. What agenda was there behind this study that you did? What was the agenda? Or is it as simple as you were looking to burst bubbles?
Well, I mean, I was recruited into Reach to raise the profile of Reach in the industry because we didn't have the same profile as, some more illustrious media owners. And I think the interesting thing is the reason we went down this route and working with Ian is because we felt like we had quite an authentic place or positioning to talk about, mainstream audiences because of the nature of our brands that were very mainstream. And secondly, from my perspective, if you want to get out there, you need to be provocative. And there's not much more provocative than a media owner turning around to the industry that spends money with them, telling them you're completely out of touch. And also having the guts to do that as well.
Yes.
The thing is yes, all industry research is pushing a particular thing, but as long as the research is sound and it's methodologically sound and it's done the right way, then there's nothing wrong with that because, everybody has biases. Everybody is pushing an agenda, but good research feels true as well. And the reason why we were able to do this is because actually I'd go in and present the research, and they'd all sort of like nod along and say, yeah, you know what, you're right. And it's not that being out of touch was a unique thing, because it's been talked about a long time. I think it's the way we did it and the way we went under the surface, which I think really attracted people and engaged people with our research.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair to you, I think maybe I was trying to be slightly provocative there in my question.
Fine.
You do then go on to say in the same article that it doesn't mean that because there's an agenda that the research isn't valid whatsoever.
Yeah.
It's just, again, I suppose in a way it's just getting that context of the research, isn't it, and understanding that. Funny enough, you've used the word provocative a few times, and Ian, you've talked about things being interesting a few times, and I think I really like the way those two elements interact together in that study that you just spoke about. And in fact, Ian, you said in terms of your choices in education were kind of led by, or in part by, what you found interesting. And I think you suggested that might have been naive, but actually, I think in your defence, I think that's probably where most people want to be in life, to be researching, or not necessarily researching, but to be in a place that they find interesting, because if that doesn't drive you, I'm not sure what does.
Yeah, I think when I said naive, I meant I was putting it in the, if you like, the historic, because at the time, when I finished my first degree and there were no jobs, and I had a political philosophy degree, and having had the background that I'd had economically, I felt naive at that point. I wished that I'd done accountancy or medicine or something, But in the long run, as I say, getting to the stage now when people ask about when Andrew and I remember Andrew and I presenting at an event, and a young guy coming up and asking me exactly that, effectively saying, how did he get to do the work that I was doing? And I don't have a really satisfactory, neat answer for that, other than you have to do the stuff you believe in and they're interested in. Because I think the work that Andrew and I have done, if I'd have been doing the kind of trying to guess what the career moves were, we'd never have done the work.
Yes.
I think as well, just to add to that, I think that's what made, I guess, the work we did for me very rewarding, because I think once Ian and I got into kind of researching this, it then became like a real, I guess, like labour of love. Like I really genuinely believe in what we were doing. We saw all the research, and it is just so interesting. And it kind of, I think that's what drove us on to do other stuff, because it then became, quite a passion of mine. I know it's a passion of Ian. So it made doing these things fun and enjoyable. And that's, what we all want from a job, right? Is to enjoy it.
Yes, and there's no point being provocative for the sake of being provocative. If it is that, and it's also interesting, then that seems to be a really good spot to be. Can you talk briefly about the London bubble? Because I think as an industry, and I say this as an agency owner or consultancy owner, I think, Andrew, you're one of the people who have said to me in recent times that GASP isn't an agency, we're a consultancy, and that's thrown up all sorts of questions in my own head, and I think you're probably more right than you are wrong with that observation. But I'm no alien to the London conversation, and I think from a positioning perspective, we have always quite loudly and proudly positioned ourselves as an outside of London agency. But then I think a lot of your research suggests that actually there isn't really a London divide at all. What is it about the London bubble? Why are we so confused with it? And what is the reality there?
Yeah, I mean, I've obviously written about this, and Ian's written about it as well. I think we've always, in our writing, made it clear that it's a marketing bubble, not a London bubble, because all the data, as you mentioned at the outset of the podcast, is that there are no differences in terms of people's values or how they see the world, and their perceptions or understanding of mainstream audiences, whether you're based in London or the rest of the UK. And I think it was one of the frustrating things that I guess Ian and I had, was that when people talked about our studies, they very much kind of grounded it in the fact that we were talking about the London bubble. But I don't think we ever mentioned the London bubble, did we?
No.
In any of our work. And I think talking about a London bubble is quite convenient for marketeers, because I've been around the country presenting our research, and you get a lot of people, particularly in the Manchester agency, saying, "Oh, these results don't apply to us," and they've got a big big proud grin on their face. And then again, for people in London as well, it's like, well, it's just, it's all to do with where we live and we can't do anything about it because we live in this big metropolitan city.
I lived in London for 21 years. Spent a bit of time in New York as well. So London bubble, it could be the New York bubble, would be the same kind of thing. But the idea that we're in the centre of the universe, unique metropolitan environments that, affect us, we need to let ourselves off the hook because it's just, such a special environment. To be totally honest, it actually sickens me, because if you look at any kind of data at all, like government data, I was saying this there was a post a couple of days ago on LinkedIn. Stephen Lacey, who's one of my old friends, who's got his agency, The Outsiders, and does a lot of work talking about, as the name suggests, outsider groups. He was writing a thing about, he's doing some training, and it was all about the cost of living crisis and how people that were in poverty, how they were different from the mainstream. And this is the thing we've just talked about, the academic research that we apply to get to the gut instinct work. And this is how hardwired these kind of biases are. The idea is we're looking for differences and also at the same time looking for a kind of excuse for why we don't get it as an industry. And London is home to some of the most deprived local authority areas in Europe. And as the agency world has moved from the west of London to the east of London and began to colonise Hackney, Tower Hamlets, Shoreditch, etc., it is every day doing its business in two of the most unequal and deprived local authority areas in Europe. And the idea that then the industry turns around and says, we can't understand real lives, or we have to go get out there beyond the M25 and hang out in a pub in Newcastle to understand, go on the poverty safari. I honestly find, I just think it's an indictment of the industry. And so one of the things I've talked about quite a lot is that there's this great film by a guy called Zed Nelson. It was all about how Hoxton Street has changed and coped with gentrification.
Yeah, it's a brilliant film.
You know the film, and along City Road, all the skyscrapers go up, and increasingly the vista's completely dwarfed by this other London that's happening. But also how all the little businesses, the carpet shop and the pie and mash shop, and all the things that are there forever are kind of changing. And Zed Nelson, in some ways, lucked out because he happened to be filming this through the course of Brexit. And of course, that narrative is in there. But the other thing that just struck me was, if you watch it, you realise that these people in our industry that are saying they're in the London bubble are walking past all of this going on every day on their way into the agency. And then they turn around and talk about cultural strategy and cultural insight, and they can't even see what's in front of them when they walk out the door of their agency. So I think it's, as you can tell, it is almost in one phrase, that's all you need to know about what's wrong right now and what we're trying to do with the work that me and Andrew are doing to put this stuff right.
Yeah. Can't see for looking.
Yeah.
So, I feel like I know the answer now, but is that a big part of the choice of the Burst Your Bubble name for your new consultancy?
Yeah. I think when we were talking about setting up the business, we obviously had, other names in mind, but we just felt that when we were putting it in our simplest of terms is that, the marketing industry and the advertising industry is full of little bubbles, whereas there's obviously an overarching bubble as well. And we just felt, well, Ian and I are a big believer in doing what it says on the tin. And, Burst Your Bubble, we felt was quite a clear statement of intent and positioning in terms of what we want to do. So, yeah, I think when we kind of finally settled on that, I think we were quite comfortable that people will understand what we're saying.
Is the existence of bubbles just reflective of, I don't know, a sort of delusion? Or is that quite common, do you think, for people in general to not quite see the context as they should?
One of the other things we say, and we're making sure this is quite prominent in our copy and the story that we tell about the business, is that everyone has bubbles. So for example, someone said to me probably a couple of days after we launched, quite rightly being quite chancellor, Ian, what are your bubbles? And I was quite happy to tell them what they all are. The thing that we're saying is that all you can be doing is try and be aware of them, and what are effectively one of the offers that we are making with Burst Your Bubble is bringing in a whole range of frameworks from behavioural science and management science that give people tools to recognise the bubbles and manage them and take broader perspectives. So we aren't saying that there's some pure kind of form here. We don't believe in anything called objectivity. Human beings, from an evolutionary perspective, are wired up to, frankly, have biases and bubbles, but if you're in an industry which supposedly depends on insight and cultural insight and understanding, etc., you've got to be in the business of being able to manage those bubbles and biases and, not just be kind of, driven by them. So that's the difference here. We're all human beings, and people who work in marketing are as human as anybody else, but a core part of the job has to be having the discipline to burst our bubbles, basically. And that's the difference here, is that, we're not looking for some pure version. We're just saying identify them, manage them, do the best you can to take the other perspectives that are definitely out there,
I'm really pleased you said that, because that's really clarified. In fact, what are your bubbles is a brilliant question. I wish I'd asked that. Yeah. But I suppose in many ways it's like it's market orientation, isn't it? It's just understanding and being aware that you will have biases, and you need to research to discover what truly is, not what you think it is.
So one of the things, for example, if we were doing the workshops or the training around this stuff, the perspective taking, is that Andrew and I, because through all the work we've done over 7 years, every framework that we've used, we know where we are on those frameworks as well. So we're very aware of what our biases are, and what we would do if we were in an agency, we'd be very transparent about those. The point is, one of the key points in the perspective-taking framework, if you like, that we're talking about, is this thing called reflexivity, building the capacity to be aware of what your makeup is psychologically, values, etc., and be aware that there's other perspectives out there and manage it. So, Big Five personality, I'm off the scale, extrovert and open to new experiences, but I'm also very low in agreeableness, and I know it, so I'll if that doesn't put up at the start of the workshop, that we'll go around and we'll figure out what everybody else's are, that's
why Ian and I have so many arguments. The key point here is that we make it very clear that it's not about changing your own values and beliefs, which some people, think that's what it's about, but it's not. It's just being able to understand your biases and see things from multiple perspectives. Everyone has their own values and beliefs, and we don't want to change those or impact those in any way, but we need to open our minds and see things from different perspectives.
And this comes into a little bit of the stuff that Andrew and I obviously have ventured into the purpose debate as well. And one of the key points here, and a little bit of a build on the published work so far in the white papers, is that if you have a social purpose, for example, the point isn't to say, oh, hang on, the mainstream feel differently from the elites in the marketing industry, you should be more like the mainstream. That's not what we're saying at all. We're flipping it the other way and saying, if as an industry you believe these things, right, and you want to promote that agenda, I'm not debating the rights and wrongs of that, right? I'm just saying, from a strategic point of view, you have an objective here, a communication objective and a strategic objective. The best chance you're going to give yourself of achieving that is to find all the different ways that you need to land that out there in the messy world that's out there, rather than, as our research has shown today, is that the industry tends to just simply try and project its values onto the mainstream. So the point about this is this is how you achieve your objective. It's not about changing the industry to be more like the mainstream. It's saying engage with the mainstream and exactly how they think to further your objective, basically, whether it's commercial or a social objective.
Yeah, that actually leans quite nicely into one of our 2 listener questions.
We interrupt this podcast to announce that we will never interrupt this podcast with ads. Ads that awkwardly nudge you to contact the pod's host Giles Edwards on 01189 952 007. Only last week, some pod listening companies did just that, calling for guidance on research and lead generation. But we're not asking you to do that. Anyway, back to the show.
Marketing is incredibly confused with sales.
I think you're the one who's more confused, Gary V. Sunshine.
So asking the general public for their opinion, be it on Brexit or boat names, is notoriously fraught with danger, but that's not stopped us asking. So I'm going to start with the slightly heavier one, and this comes from Josh. Josh says, with a nod to Call to Action pod guest Steve Harrison, do you think the left-leaning makeup of Adland influences the industry's infatuation with social purpose?
So glad someone's asked that question. Go on, Ian.
The thing is, it comes to a very, very key point of clarification, and we made this point explicitly in several places, is that the marketing industry is not left-leaning, right? It might think it's left-leaning, it might have a self-identity, and we said this very explicitly in our research, it self-identifies as left-leaning, but there is nothing in the wider set of values or the thinking styles and all the things we've referenced in this conversation that are compatible with any, and Andrew and I are both, academic training in political science. It would be a recognisable version of what we would regard as a left-wing worldview. Yeah, so that's along the London bubble as one of the other big myths that there is in the industry. What the industry is liberal and progressive. Yeah, so it's socially liberal, but the idea that bolting on all the different kind of social projects that there is, whether it's diversity or the environment or any of the others, onto effectively unregulated free market capitalism is a left-wing idea is actually, frankly, nuts, So that's another thing there. So the industry is definitely has a liberal social agenda, but that is not a left-wing agenda from an economic point of view. And in fact, I'd go far as to say that pursuing it in that way and thinking it's left-wing is actually probably counterproductive, in that it's actually kind of sustaining the thing that a lot of the young progressive people in the industry think that they're combating, because actually it's making you think that you can solve the biggest collective problems we have in society, like, as I say, the environment or, inequality, through hyper-individualistic consumption. So I can't see how there's anything left-wing about that at all. And me and Steve Harrison have had this debate and a lot of fun with it over a few years since he's published Can't Sell, Won't Sell, which he very generously referenced our work all the way through, and there's a lot of the stuff, points he's made very, very well as the great copywriter he is. But when he talks about the left-wing takeover of marketing, I'm on record as saying I just think he's got that wrong, and it's not what our work says at all.
Cool. That was a very good answer. Andrew, I'm going to ask you the second question, which comes from Anne. Anne asks, it feels like as marketers, we have more data than ever. The industry is awash with research, but how do you sort the half-decent stuff from the total BS?
Oh, I mean, the first thing you can do is attend our workshop on research for open thinkers, which will give you all these answers. It's a tricky one because there is a lot of stuff out there. Like I said, a lot of stuff with an agenda. And I think the challenge is that, a lot of people in the industry are time poor. They don't have the time to critically assess what's being put in front of them. We also, as mentioned, have our own biases. So we're less likely to, if something matches or speaks to our view of the world, then we're more likely to believe it, and rather than push back on it. And I think this is a real problem because insight is underpinning, strategic decision making. and you have to be confident in the insight and the research that's put in front of you. I think the challenge is there is no easy answer to this, which is why we've designed a workshop for it, because I think there is so much being put out there that there needs to be some, I'm not talking about a deep methodological understanding, but there are certain things like, I mean, I wrote in Marketing Week, I had 3 very basic kind of pointers to spot, good and bad research. One is you always have a starting point of who's the research from, understanding their agenda. It's fine, they might have an agenda, but then there are 2 additional steps in terms of understanding social desirability as a concept. Is the research I'm seeing prompting a socially desirable response? And then that leads into a third point around agree-disagree statements, because essentially what most research tries to do when they're trying to position themselves or push a particular agenda is they use agree-disagree statements. And agree-disagree statements tends to get you high percentages, it tends to get PR, but actually a lot of those statements aren't really reflective of real life and how people behave, particularly when it comes to consumption and buying behaviors. And you talked before, the previous question talked about asking people certain things and what people say and what people do. Now, obviously, we know there is a difference in what people say and what people do, but you can mitigate for that through good survey design. And I think, sadly, there is a lack of quality in survey design more generally out there, and all it does is leads to skepticism of everything. When actually there is some very good research which is designed correctly, which can mitigate some of the differences between attitude and behavior. And then ultimately it's all about the interpretation. And like we said, is that, we tend to be straight line thinkers and sometimes the interpretation goes a bit awry. So like I said, there's no easy answers. There's some frameworks that you can use to assess research. But that's exactly why we've designed this workshop for kind of end users of research, to help give them quite a nice framework for assessing research moving forward.
Yeah. The final part of our interview then, Andrew and Ian, is our 4 pertinent poses. What advice would you give to your younger self?
Probably that there is no linear path and you have to take the good with the bad. Not everything works out as you hope it will work out, but it all happens for a reason. And wherever you want to get, if you push and try hard enough, even though you might take a few detours on the way, you'll get there in the end.
A lot to be said for being able to change your mind. And I mean that from a kind of, career perspective as well, because I think, sometimes people worry that, they might look flaky or, kind of unreliable or whatever. But I just think if you're critically engaging with what you're doing and you want to do your best work and something isn't working, I think you have to have the kind of, be able to say, hang on, this isn't it. And that links into Andrew's point about not being linear, So, I started off in academic research. It was very interesting, but I realised that, I kind of wanted to maybe earn a little bit more money than academics do. And so I changed my mind, and then I was doing political research and I thought, that's a bit routine. So how about this advertising and brand stuff? And I think you just have to kind of, be able to change your mind, especially these days when everything's so kind of fluid anyway.
Yeah, really good answers. And actually, I don't think in 100 and almost 20 episodes, I don't think we've ever had someone say that about changing your mind. And I agree. I think there's a real maturity when people are prepared to openly change their minds. But I think maybe when you're younger, you fear it's the opposite.
I always remember I went to see a client once and we're doing an annual review of the account. And my client said to me about her boss, says, look, it's all great. The only comment we've got is he said, we love seeing Ian and the team. The only problem is every time he comes here, he tells us something different. And I came away and thought that was the best thing ever. And the rest of the team, we all went out for a drink after, and they were worried about this comment because saying different or changing your mind from the last presentation you give to the next one sounded like a bad thing. flaky or unreliable. And all I thought I was doing was thought about it a bit more and had thought about it and come up with a better answer. So I think it's a cultural thing again in the industry, but I really think if you can change your mind, you get to a better place, basically.
Yeah, exactly that, if it's informed. We'll start with you, Ian. If you could banish one thing from the industry, what would it be and why?
The word insight. I use insight as much as anybody else does because I feel it's the basic currency of, what I do for a living. But I think it's actually a very narrow framing of what the industry should be doing in terms of, and you touched on this with your quick fires at the beginning, Giles. I think it was Andrew that got this one. You said to Andrew, is it understanding or insight? And if Andrew would have answered insight, I think that might have been the end of Burst Your Bubble. It's like, because it's a core thing about it. Because the point is that insight is only a small fraction of what we do. Understanding is it. Sometimes what you need, a lot of what we talk about is the industry needs to be more aware of the stuff that already exists, the stuff that lots of other people already know, but for some reason, as an industry in our collective memories, we've forgotten or we never get round to finding out in the first place. So I think the obsession with insight leads us down a very narrow path. I also think it makes the work incredibly pressurised and unfulfilling if you think you have to be coming up with these things called insights all the time. Because frankly, you're lucky in your career if you have a handful of decent insights in your career. And the idea you can churn out, half a dozen by lunchtime is just a really debilitating and dispiriting way to work. So I would ban the word insight.
Yeah, insights for cash. That's what it's sort of become, isn't it? Brilliant. Andrew, what are you banishing?
I'm just going to have to say the word Gen Z.
Specifically Gen Z or any generational cohorts?
Well, I suppose it's because it's the thing at the moment. I know we're kind of on the precipice of Gen Alpha. Don't even get me started on that. But
can't wait.
I'm so fed up with, quite frankly, all the crap that gets published about Gen Z. The research on Gen Z is just so shockingly bad. And I'm not a huge fan of, the concept of, the obsession with different generations and things like that. But I'm just sick to the back teeth of seeing that term Gen Z and a piece of crap research and being told that, this generation are unlike any other and yada, yada, yada. And it's just repeat ad infinitum. And I've just had enough. I've hit boiling point on it. Right. So I would just get rid of that term if I could.
Nice. Yeah, I'll back both of those. Are there any books that you guys can recommend to our listeners?
Yeah. So I mentioned The Road to Somewhere at the beginning because Ian thought that was quite controversial when I chose that over The Righteous Mind.
I thought you'd have gone for The Righteous Mind.
Well, I thought about it, but then I thought which book had a more profound impact on my view of the world, and I actually think it was because that's the book that I was reading when we first kind of came up with the first project, and we referenced it in Gut Instinct. Obviously, The Righteous Mind is a great book. To be honest, I love reading marketing books. I love Decoded as a book. I just think it's one of the best books out there. It's fascinating. I know it's been updated as well. So I'm a big fan of that book. And then obviously Orlando's books are great reading as well. I think if you work in advertising, you have to read Orlando's books. Like, I just think they're so unique and clever in the way that it's positioned. And I'm a big fan of Orlando's writing. Ian, any to add to that?
Books that aren't about marketing that kind of are really useful to marketing. John Kay's Obliquity, which is another one that Andrew and I do reference in the white papers, and it fits in with a lot of the stuff we've been talking about today. That idea that your objectives are best achieved indirectly rather than directly, and that's one of the reasons why maybe insight is the way it is, because we think, oh, that's what we need this new insight, but actually going in a broader journey. So John Kay, an incredibly eclectic book that just shows loads of examples, real world examples about how when you get too direct about your objectives, it goes wrong. So for example, when Boeing decided that what Boeing was about wasn't making the best aeroplanes it could and letting the designers figure out all the latest aerodynamic ways of doing that, and decided they were about shareholder value. It turned out they started making much worse aeroplanes, so those kinds of things. It's a really good one. I think there's a lot in that for marketers. Loads of stuff. It's a bit like when you ask what your favourite song or album is, Giles. I tend to end up just talking about the one that I'm reading now or I've just finished listening to, kind of thing.
Yeah.
But there's two really short little ones that are almost more like pamphlets that talk to some of the stuff I was just talking about in terms of the left-wingness or not of the industry, by the feminist philosopher Nancy Fraser. So Feminism for the 99% is one of them. Another one's called, I'll get it off my shelf so I remember the name, The Old is Dying and the New Cannot Be Born. So for all the kind of political geeks like me and Andrew, that's a quote from the Marxist philosopher Gramsci. But the point here is that both of these talk about what Nancy Fraser calls progressive neoliberalism. And that's what I think, if you read these, you'd see a lot of what our industry's purpose narrative is actually about. It's that thing about we have the liberal progressive part, but we've forgotten about, if you like, the social justice and economic distribution part. And so if we really want the argument in this is, and that's why feminism for the 99% is saying, if you really want to change the situation for women, you've got to think about economic inequality in the way that we structure society rather than just the identity element of it. And that's the example for feminism. But that philosophy can extend out to, I think, most of the social issues that our industry is talking about right now. And they're both about 70 pages, so you can read them in, an hour and a half or something like that. And I think that would give a lot of people that are trying to do really great work in terms of pursuing a social agenda, to our point and burst your bubble, might give them a slightly different perspective on how they should go about pursuing those social goals.
Amazing. Well, we'll link to all of those in this show's listing. And then finally, we always dedicate every episode to someone, and we bestow or hospital pass that honour, depending on your view, to our guest, who has to give their reason why. So I don't mind if you have an individual dedication or a joint one, but yeah, over to you.
I was a bit soppy. I'll probably dedicate it to my sister, just because I kind of followed her career in terms of into research. I think if it wasn't for her, I would probably have, it's debatable whether I would have had the career path I had. And she's also a great researcher, and she's had a tough year, so I would dedicate it to her.
Wonderful. Can I ask her name?
Yeah, it's Jo Tenzer.
Brilliant. Ian, anyone else to add?
I'm going to kind of double down on that. Mine's is my mum. It's Ruby Murray, actually, which was always great when I used to.
Wow, how cool is that?
I used to live off Commercial Road, so going down Brickell Lane, it was great when you told the guys in the restaurants that they were serving Ruby Murray. That always worked quite well.
Oh, wonderful.
But for the reasons I alluded to at the beginning, she brought 5 kids up on her own, and there's a lot of talk at the moment about social mobility and all the barriers that there is to social mobility. But one of the other ones that's there as well is if you're in, tight economic circumstances, there's a realism that means a lot of kids just don't consider university as an option. And in the circumstances I was in, my mum could quite, in lots of ways justifiably, directed me into a more, practical, start earning some money type situation. But as I say, university, study whatever you want at university, just do what interests you. And so I got it all from my mum, basically.
Well, hats off to, I have so much respect for single mums in general, but to raise 5, hats off to Ruby Murray. This episode is very proudly dedicated to Jo Tenzer and Ruby Murray. Wonderful. So as a final call to action, everyone can head over to this listing. We'll include links to all of the books. So they are The Road to Somewhere, The Righteous Mind, Decoded by Phil Barden, who's been on the pod, Lemon and Lookout by the wonderful Orlando, who was on last month, in fact, Obliquity, Feminism for the 99%, and The Old is Dying and the New Cannot Be Born. We will link also to the Burst Your Bubble website, but how else can our listeners get more Andrew and Ian?
They can contact us on LinkedIn, on Twitter.
Great. Okay, so LinkedIn and Twitter, and of course the website, which we will include. Listen, both, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure and a huge privilege to talk.
Loved it. Thanks very much, James.
Thanks for having us. It's been great.
And finally, thank you to everyone listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, please do share and review the podcast. Keep your questions and guest requests coming in. To get in touch, it's easy to find Gasp online, or you can email the mouthful that is call to action at gasp.agency.
I can't get no call to action. I can't get no call to action, but I try, and I try, and I try, and I try. I can't get no call to action. Oh, I can't get no call to action. Yeah.